On.
I don't know how it works.
Okay, Planning Commission meeting for January 9th. Oregon City Planning Commission is officially in order. Are there any public comments on items not listed on the agenda this evening?
We have not received any requests.
Okay. This would have been the perfect opportunity for our visitor to speak up last meeting.
I think he tried.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is the adoption of Planning Commission meeting minutes from January 9th, 2012. Has everyone on the commission had an opportunity to look at those meeting minutes?
Yes.
Any discussion or
We're
comments?
getting caught up, aren't we?
Slowly but surely.
Any comments or corrections? Do we have a motion to adopt those meeting minutes?
I would so move.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion to adopt the Planning Commission minutes of January 9th, 2012. And a second. Commissioner Mahoney?
Aye.
Commissioner McGriff?
Aye.
Commissioner Mabey?
Abstain, but for the record, I would have voted for the same two officers that we did elect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice having
Commissioner Henkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Espy is not here, so.
Do we have enough commissioners to approve the minutes?
And you have 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I abstained. I've read them, but
I know.
Chair Kidwell?
Aye.
I believe in the Robert's Rules of Order provision that says even if you weren't at the meeting, you had an opportunity to read them and review them, you can vote on them. You're not precluded from voting on them.
vote on it.
Yes, he has that option.
I know he does. That's because he likes to be contrary.
Motion passes, the minutes are adopted.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is a continuation of TP 12-01 and VR 12-02, request for continuation from last meeting 2 weeks ago. And we have another request for continuation until July 23rd that has been requested. We'll dispense of the quasi-judicial public hearing notes, but for this evening, we will read the ex parte. Does any commissioner have any ex parte contacts, conflicts, bias, or any other statement to declare? Has any commissioner visited the site? For the record, commissioners who have visited the site should declare that they have.
There was some discussion about previous land use files and previous decisions, so if anyone did look that up online or whatnot, I'd recommend disclosing that at this point.
I have not had a chance to do it yet.
I have nothing to declare. And does anyone in the audience wish to question the commissioners on their disclosures? Okay, see none. We'll commence with the staff report.
Staff is recommending that the Planning Commission take testimony from any member of the public present who wishes to comment on this application, and then continue the public hearing for these two files, TP 1201 and VR 1202, to a date certain of July 23rd. The reason for this is to allow additional time to review some supplemental materials that were submitted by AKS Engineering in support of their subdivision and variance application. Those materials were sent to staff June 12th, 2012. We have not had time to review them, but we plan to be able to present the staff recommendation to the Planning Commission by 1 week prior to the July 23rd, 2012 hearing. And the applicant has also sent a couple of items which are attached to your file, to your agenda there. One is from AKS Engineering, and the other is from Mike Robinson, who is here tonight representing the applicant. And be
Another thing we'd add is that the applicant has proposed that if the hearing is continued to July 23rd, they would extend the 120-day, 30 days, which is equivalent to the continuance request.
Yeah. And that would make the 120-day deadline for this application October 15th, 2012, by my calculation.
So at this time, do we take any testimony from the applicant?
I think Mr. Robbins here is here just to answer any questions, unless you'd like to come up.
Any of the commissioners have any questions for the applicant?
Good evening, Chair Kidwell, members of the Commission. Mike Robinson on behalf of John Jones. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about the request for the continuance. We do agree with Mr. Walter's staff report.
I'm not where you are.
The vast amount of information provided that you concur with.
It
The
was
2 pages.
It was concisely presented.
I move that we proceed to public comment. There is a-
Mr. Kidwell.
Okay.
That's okay, I'll read it first. We have a motion from Commissioner
Well,
Maybe.
it's not a major.
Oh, sorry.
Suggestion.
Oh, sorry.
It's not really something.
All right.
Are there any public comments at this time regarding this application?
I knew there was.
Please.
If you'd hand that to him.
Thanks.
Everybody handles it.
Yes, introduce yourself,
Call my
please.
name. She can stand up if you would.
I am Christine Kaczynski. I live in unincorporated Clackamas County. On the June 11th meeting, and I'm assuming the same for tonight, the developer, his representative is present, but the developer is here. There's not any lengthy, complete staff report, no plat maps, and no discussion regarding the traffic impact study. Therefore, I'm guessing all this information is going to be dumped on us at the final July 23rd meeting, giving the citizens a plethora of information at the last minute and little time to be prepared to give informed testimony. This process certainly puts the citizens at a huge disadvantage. I'm upset because I see a city that is attempting to keep the citizens out of actively participating in land use decisions, which is a huge breach of State Goal 1. My concerns tonight are many and are found in the details of the traffic impact study. The city had discussion with the Caulfield Neighborhood Association that clearly indicates street connections to Maple Lane are planned in the future phase. Also, in 2007, Mr. Jones indicated this subdivision would connect into Holly Lane. My question to the city is, you met with 24 citizens in the Caulfield neighborhood, but you failed to do any outreach to the 500-plus citizens of Holly Lane. Just when we were going to tell you, or when were you going to tell these good people that you're going to take their street? I refer you to page 8 of the traffic impact study, which I've included in your packet. The city has approved new homes on Thayer Road, not far from Nutmeg Lane. Is it the city's plan to bring this traffic into Nutmeg and then access onto Maple Lane and Holly? If so, this is even more ADTs per day into this intersection, and the city plans no improvements to Holly Lane, leaving residents with unsafe and unlivable conditions. In 2007, more than 113 citizens living on Holly Lane, Donovan Road, and Holly Crest signed their petition to protect the livability and safety of Holly Lane. These signatures, along with 40 citizen comment forms, were turned in to Mayor Norris and city commissioners. This petition speaks to the concerns of increased traffic coming from any and all new development proposed by Oregon City. On the back of the petition is a map which at the time in 2007 clearly indicated the plans by the city proposing to extend Holly Lane from Henrici to Maple Lane to Thayer and then to connect with Holcomb Boulevard. The Holly Lane petition was an attachment to a letter given to Mayor Norris asking the city to act upon the need for 1 to 2 more connectors between Beaver Creek Road and Redland Road, since one little street could not provide north-south connections for this huge amount of ADTs per day. What the city was proposing would have destructive impacts to the street and would place the citizens of Holly Lane in harm's way. I ask that you seriously consider the impacts of increasing traffic that Oregon City is proposing in the Maple Lane, Holly, and Redland areas. These people should not be victims to poor planning and monetary constraints that prevent the city from building the very roads they need to accommodate increasing development. In other words, development isn't paying its way. But to expect the people to suffer the ill effects of ever more residential development is simply being negligent to their needs. Even though the developer is proposing only 30 homes at this time, approval for these additional homes does create far-reaching implications for the residents of this area. I ask you to consider the fate and the future of hundreds of residents of Holly Lane who would suffer terribly if this plethora of traffic is unleashed upon their neighborhood. I ask that you not approve this application until such time that Oregon City meets with the people of Holly Lane to create a suitable plan for traffic flow that is acceptable to the hundreds of residents, children, and families who call Holly Lane their home.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Christine?
Christine?
If you could, since you got, I just have a quick question. The December 5 letter that you provided refers to talking points. Was that included in this, and we didn't get it, or is it just it's an old reference and you just didn't include it?
The letter to Mayor Norris?
Yeah, it refers to the talking points with Holly Lane residents.
I'm sorry, I can get those and drop them
No,
off
I
in
just
your
wanted
mail.
to know, it wasn't part of what you gave us, and I just didn't
No,
get a copy?
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
I remember from 2007, so I just wasn't sure.
I put a PS at the bottom if you need to see the signatures and the comments from the people. I can drop them off.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we had a complete packet.
Are there any other questions for this person? Okay.
If I may, real
Yes.
quick. The accusation of trying to suppress public input is completely unfounded. We have followed every requirement of the Oregon City Municipal Code for public notification, including putting it in the paper, posting the property, mailing it to neighbors within 300 feet of the site, notifying the neighborhood association. The complete land use application, plat maps, proposal is all online on the city's website. It's also accessible at the Community Development Department when we're open. Anyone can come in and view that. I guess I would just remind the commission that we're talking about a subdivision within the Oregon city limits. The question of north-south connections are part of a larger discussion that happened on the Park Place concept plan, the Beaver Creek Road concept plan. Holly Lane, a majority of that is it's all of it currently is outside of the city limits. Some of it is even outside of our urban growth boundary. It's difficult when we do expand the city limits. Right now, the Clackamas County Transportation System Plan is open. I would highly recommend the citizens on Holly Lane contact Clackamas County and have those discussions about the need for sidewalks on the county facility that is designed to a rural standard but has been allowed urban development in the county. We continually try to identify alternative transportation options and routes to try and alleviate that transportation impact. It is difficult in that area, and we will continue to try to do that. But I would just, once again, we're focusing on a subdivision application in the city limits that meets the zoning. They are asking for a variance for alleys, and The transportation report and those findings will be available in our staff report, but right now, all that base information, all the studies that have been done are available for the public to view online at their convenience or when we're open at the Community Development Department.
Thank you, Tony. When will the staff report and the other supporting material be available to the public to view?
The staff report will be posted.
Week prior to
One
July
week.
23rd.
Correct.
1 week ahead of the next hearing?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So there will be a week
And that's when we'll get it.
prior to that.
Yeah,
Correct.
that's right.
Public can view it.
Right.
If there's a continuance.
But the actual application itself is all available right now. It has been since it was submitted.
Okay. Great. Does the applicant wish to have any rebuttal comments?
I want to ask if there's any additional public.
Are there any other public comments to be made at this time on this application? Okay. So seeing none, we can close the public hearing portion of the agenda. And is there any discussion among the commissioners as far as the request for continuance?
I move approval of the continuance.
I have some comments. I guess with all due respect to the city knowing the code and understanding what our notice requirements are, I think the city has on occasion gone up over and beyond the call of duty, beyond the 300 feet when they have felt that there was some significant impact. And so I think that that's led up to the discretion of staff. I think that when we're going to continually run into this situation where we have urban development adjacent to county urban development that's in the county but not really to standards that the city has, there's always going to be that conflict, and how we get the word out, I think, is even more important in the sense that we do require posting of the property, but I will honestly tell you that the ones that I've seen in Oregon City, which have the little white notice taped on them, if you're driving in your car, which is about the only way you'll see them, you can't read them. There's just no way, and there may not be a safe place to pull over to get out and walk over and look at it to do that. And I've asked a couple of times that we relook at that to make, even if you put with magic marker, notice of public hearing, this file number, please call the city, that would, at least you could see it when you were going by. But I think that we just have to be very aware of that. It's something that I've been concerned about for some time, and I'm not sure there's a good answer. It's just we have to do the best that we can. I don't know how many people read the notices in the paper. I don't always read them because they're really teeny tiny. I looked at one just the other day, and it was really small. I almost had to get out my magnifying glass to actually read it, but that was in the Clackamas Review. It was probably about what I would consider about 5 point. So I just think it's just behooves us to do what we can to try to make sure that people, whether they're in the city or not, are notified about things that will affect them.
Right. Well, I think that the city is following the guidelines that they have to work with, and I do think from time to time things will slip through the crack as far as communication. But whenever we're dealing with a development that's on the fringe of the city, we are dealing with circumstances that the city doesn't have direct control over, either adjacent to another city or to a county. And those things can be difficult issues to deal with because we don't have the authority to directly affect their policies or what they do. So that's also another aspect of what we're dealing with here. We're right on the edge of the
No, I totally
urban
understand
area.
that. I guess, Tony, I would ask is that in circumstances like that, because are we the one that's paying for the notice?
It's rolled into the land use application.
Because I think sometimes maybe, again, barring to your professional discretion, that in some cases 300 feet isn't really far enough. I mean, it is when you're in an urban area, but when you're in a rural area and you have larger properties, maybe 500, maybe something beyond, that depending on if you took your compass and went around it and said, oh, there's only 3 properties here. It gets rough. And maybe we can look at that at a future discussion that, if we're outside, right adjacent to the city limits, that maybe we could look at an exception to use a larger boundary where we've got larger properties and we don't have, well, we know that there's a broader maybe interest area.
I think the county notice area is 500 feet.
Well, that's because they have bigger.
They got bigger parcels.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. And we have, when we're on the edge, we might have our lots, but then you've got somebody that might have 5 acres and 300 feet is, well.
And we do notice the CPOs as well
Yeah.
for any land use application.
Do they have a CPO out there?
Holcomb Outlook is the one that.
What about the Holly Lane area?
And then Beaver Creek Hamlet comes up clear to, I think, and Christine could tell me, Redland Road, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, good job.
Yeah.
The other thing I would comment is I think the city is doing a really good job of putting information on the website. And I was a little bit disappointed last meeting with someone who came forward with a concern about traffic in their neighborhood and zoning, and came to find out later in our discussion about the transportation plan that nobody from that area had gone to the website and made any comments on the transportation system website. And yet that was exactly what it was there for, was for people to have that interactive input. So I don't think it's all necessarily lack of city notification or providing the information. Sometimes I think people just don't assimilate that information and react to it. I know we went through, with the Water Master Plan here, a number of public meetings and workshops, and I was astounded at how few people came for those from the public, and yet it was a fairly significant issue that people should have taken interest in. So that being said,
Can I ask, Pete, is there a way to put a link to the previous material, or you could, because I don't really know when this subdivision happened in the meeting date.
The first Crabtree.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, there is, and we'll definitely make sure that you get that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
great.
Yeah.
Can we take a motion to continue this hearing to
I think Damon started it.
But it didn't have a second.
I'll second it.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mabey, second by Commissioner Mahoney to grant the applicant's request for continuance for TP 1201 and VR 1202 to date certain of July 23rd, 2012, Planning Commission regular meeting. And I should go.
Question?
Yes.
No, question. I'm calling for the
Oh,
question.
okay. Commissioner Mahoney,
Aye.
Commissioner McGriff,
Aye.
Commissioner Mabey,
Aye.
Commissioner Henking, Chair Kidwell.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much.
The next item on our agenda is a work session, joint session with the Oregon City Natural Resource Committee.
And I guess before we do that, I'll give just a couple of quick updates. The City Commission at their last meeting did approve the contract with Kogan Owens Kogan for the South End Concept Plan, so we hope to get that moving forward shortly. We did a media tour of the Blue Heron site with representatives from the Oregonian, OPB, KGW, as well as the Metro has their own internal independent news agency. So we did see the first article is out on the Metro website that was written by their reporter who was on that site visit. And we continue to do our due diligence work out on Blue Heron. I do apologize for the late request to see if anybody wanted to join us on that boat tour. We had some very last-minute cancellations, but there were probably about 7 open spots on the boat, so we had a pretty good turnout for that. And were able to go up and spend some time looking at blue heron from the water side, and then up by the falls, and then over to the Westland paper mill side, and got some of the history over there with the Sullivan plant and the fish ladders and whatnot. So that went very well. It was a nice day, at least. So other than that was kind of a quick update. We're still working on the transportation system plan. I'm sure all of you have probably read David Wimmer, our finance director, is retired, and then Nancy Krushauer
Retiring or retired officially?
He's retiring. Yeah. So
Isn't June 30th his last day?
yeah, I think he's going to stay on and help, maybe. And then Nancy Krushauer did take a job down in Wilsonville as their community development director. So her last day, I think, will be July 2nd or so. It'll be that first week in July. So wish them both well, and they will both be missed. That's all I have. And
6:45 tomorrow is when they are yakking about the story about the Blue Heron Mill.
OPD?
I listened to OPD.
Rob
constantly.
Manning finally got it. He had a lot of tape.
Yeah, they were saying in the broadcast tonight that 6:45, blah, 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 something about the mill and developers are drooling over the site, yada, yada, yada. And then he said, and be sure to listen at 6:45 tomorrow.
Oh, great.
That's
Thank
good to
you.
know.
Yeah. Good.
So that's going to be on.
Yes. So I guess we would, for the work session, we'd propose maybe a 10-minute break so we can set up some tables and then come back and have that work session with the Natural Resource Committee, if that would be
Sounds
fine. Okay.
And just,
I'm going to pause the meeting, but please remind me to restart it once we get the table
I
set
just
up.
wanted to say for the record that I was at the Willamette Falls meeting on the 20th, and I want to say publicly that Tony did a great job
Thank you.
in presenting the issues in a very short but succinct manner, because he had like 5 seconds, it seemed like. I think they gave you 6 minutes,
Yeah.
maybe. But he presented a very good report. There were no real conclusions other than I think the people walked out of the room and said, yeah, we don't think that the Corps of Engineers should be in charge of it, but we don't have any great ideas about how to get there. So it was tough. But there was a lot, the room was packed, and there were a lot of people there. And as a matter of fact, David Brown, who's the executive vice president of the Trust, National Trust for Historic Preservation, is coming out the 3rd week in July. I guess there's going to be yet another tour of the locks and so forth and so on. And I think I'm going to skip that one. I've been on that tour now like 5 times in the last 10 years.
Give it.
Well, yeah, I think I could give it. Yeah, there you go. But yeah, so he's coming out. So everybody's got to see the locks. So that's good. Good. Get a little public
While we're
attention.
in the mode of updates, I'll just give a quick update. The transportation TSP meeting that we had about a week and a half ago was very productive and a good turnout, and it seems like they're moving ahead in a good positive direction. One of the things that we went through was in the agenda of how they were valuing the different goals and objectives. We had a fairly extensive discussion about how those were being weighed, and they had 8 different goals. Each one had anywhere from 3 to 5 objectives, and what we discovered in the course of the conversation is that they were all being weighed equally, which in the course of discussion everybody agreed that didn't make any sense. So they will be circulating a survey among all the people that are involved in the TSP program, either as a stakeholder or the technical committee, and weighing those goals and objectives based on which are the most important in that list. So that'll be, I guess, part of the next round of considerations.
And Charles, when is the next workshop?
I don't know if a date's been set
It
yet.
seems to me it was going to be in late August,
They spaced
but
them
they
out.
don't have a date set for it yet.
Yeah.
I've been seeing the posters for it just about everywhere that I've been wandering around in Oregon City, so that's good.
Laura's been doing a great job of kind of coordinating that, and the website, if you haven't been to the website, is very informative. Okay,
Great.
work session.
All right, well, I'll pause this meeting for the time being and get the table set up.
I think you have to close the public meeting.
Is it public meeting closed?
Now it is.
Okay. Very good.
I'd like to thank everyone for Natural Resource Committee members for coming out and joining us. One of the goals of the Planning Commission is to meet with the other committees for a check-in, to talk about what you're working on, talk about what we're working on a little bit, and then other issues that may be out there. So I'll go ahead and we can probably start this. And
Should we introduce ourselves? Since
that'd be
we
great.
don't know everybody else's
Yeah.
names?
Yeah, sure.
I can start. I'm Brian Boyce. I'm chair of the Natural Resources Committee.
Richard Craven. Bob Roth.
Well, I was hoping you might say a little bit about your background, why
Okay,
you want to be on here, because
Yeah, I can do that. I have a wide and varied background. I've run two different businesses in my course of my life. Worked for a number of different companies. Do everything from landscape design to computer database work. Being a small businessman, I know how to do passably well, at least, a wide variety of things. So, hard to pigeonhole me. I'm chairman of the board of the Clackamas River Basin Council, and do a lot of work in that area as well. So that gives you a little bit of an idea.
The Basin Council is responsible for what?
The entire Clackamas River Basin, sort of an oversight. We're doing a lot of different things right now. We have a huge project funded by PG as part of their relicensing for their power facilities at the Clackamas, which involve planting about 30 miles of tributary stream-side trees that isn't currently in trees. And we're in the process of identifying people that want that done. We've got our first year's quota in line, but that's going to go on for 5 years to get up to the, and plus there's going to be time after that. So it's going to be over a 10-year commitment. And it's gotten our budget way up there, from what it was originally. But we do a wide variety of restoration projects, things like removing culverts that allow salmon to go further upstream. And we more than once were within a day or two of getting that project completed in the allowable period where you can work in water. And salmon started showing up immediately in days, spawning upstream where they couldn't before. So that's an example. We do stuff on the ground. We're not, the protest group type of thing, but we were out there getting things done and working with other agencies to do that.
Have you had any interaction with the Western Rivers Conservancy?
We haven't worked with them yet. We have a wide range that we do work with.
I just asked because they're a tenant in our building where my office is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's so many groups out there that all have something they're doing. It would probably be good to talk with someone like that, see what they're up to and how we could dovetail or not.
Yeah, they actually had a pretty unique project a couple of years ago that I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, they decommissioned an old power generating station that was no longer being used and had a dam removed off of the Sandy River.
Oh, yeah, that big dam that they took out of the Sandy.
Yeah, so they were involved in
Yeah.
that whole process of restoration of that section of river.
Marmot Dam, is that the one?
I don't remember.
I think that was, yeah, because that was a pretty big event. And
And your background?
Natural resources, degrees in zoology or fisheries related, aquatic biology related things. Environmental consultant for about 40 years in Oregon. And worked on a lot of water resource development projects around the western United States.
Bob Roth, most recently I was the volunteer program development specialist for the city of Tiger, trying to help the communities and cities' capacity to utilize volunteers. And a little bit of watershed background myself, I'm the former Salem Kaiser Watershed Council coordinator for Pringle, Claggett, Glen Gibson, and Mill Creeks down in Marion and Glen Gibson Creeks. And I was before that, the original Johnson Creek Watershed Council coordinator. We did things like the Johnson Creek Summit, bringing stakeholders together to address watershed issues, and organizing these watershed-wide events where you do a whole series of restoration education projects in the watershed all on the same date.
That's great. Sounds like we've got the right people on this committee.
I'm Denise Griffin. I'm a member of the Planning Commission, and I'm finally made it as a 25-year club here for living in Oregon City. And in my spare time, I'm a community activist,
And
a land use planner by profession.
land use planner with the Portland.
Well, actually, I don't do that for the commission.
But that's your profession.
It is my profession, but my job is at the Portland Development Commission, and I'm a project manager working in 5 of our 11 urban renewal districts, doing project management, small business lending, you name it, we do it.
Bob Mahoney, background in planning, retired on the planning commission.
Damon Mabey, Planning Commission. I'm just passing the 48-year mark in Oregon City.
Community activists.
Former city commissioner, and then, community activist. Want to, see my city grow the right way. After living in LA, I know the wrong way.
Charles Kidwell, Planning Commission Chair, and I'm an architect by profession. Oregon City resident since 1977. So, like to see things done the right way here. My family lives here, so I've got a vested interest in how things are developed.
Zach Henkin, Planning Commission. I work for a local solar installer in Oregon City. My wife works in Oregon City School District. Community volunteer and sometime community activist local.
I'm Pete Walter. I've been with the Oregon City Planning Department for coming up on 6 years. Before that, I was a planner in Colorado and a forester. Got into community development through work in the Peace Corps agroforestry program, and it seemed to suit my talents a little better than straight forestry. So, but it's kind of coming back around.
the city might be hiring something.
The rate we're going.
Yeah.
Tony Conkle, Community Development Director. I've been with Oregon City almost 11 years. Kind of been through the trenches here and started here as a planner and worked my way up, processing current land use applications, long-term concept plans, rewrote a lot of the code amendments that we saw in 2002, 2004, 2008. Was part of the comprehensive plan rewrite when we did that in 2002, 2004. So we have pretty extensive knowledge of our code here in Oregon City.
Should
Yeah, should we?
give a little history of
Yeah, I guess maybe we could start with just a little recap of how you guys are doing with Natural Resources Committee now that we've got that up and running. And
It's definitely running. We've, on the subject tonight, we've, passed 1 or 2 heritage trees, the first ones ever. And there's, the things that we started noticing was that there's parts of the code that aren't fully defined and maybe improperly defined and so on that I think we need to address. And that's really how we got here to this meeting, I believe. So, but we've been looking at various things around the city that different issues, but we're really just getting rolling. I don't think we've really fully gotten there yet, but this is one of the projects that I'd like to see get dealt with, and so that's going to be, that's what we're here to discuss, basically.
Is it the project for the heritage trees?
Yeah, the project of rewriting the code so that it's better written and more effective.
Yeah, and I'll give a little background on the code that we have in place today. In 2008, we started doing a lot of code revisions. You guys are familiar with that. And part of those included this section 1208-040, which provides for a process for nomination of heritage trees and heritage groves on both public and private property. And the code was adopted along with all those other code revisions. And now that we've actually started using this code, we've started to see its benefits and some of the areas where it needs to be better defined. At the time that the code was adopted, the Natural Resources Committee was not functioning at that time. However, we've been sending the heritage tree nominations that have been submitted to the Natural Resources Committee for review and a subsequent recommendation to the City Commission. So today we have 2 heritage trees that have been passed by the City Commission on private property, and the most recent public heritage tree grove nomination was approved or recommended for approval last week. Is that right? Which included Waterboard Park and the Public Works Master Plan site. So that has not been to the City Commission yet. But that's kind of where we're at today.
You spelled Arbor wrong.
Arbor.
Are you British?
A-R-B-O-R.
The British version, yeah.
Yeah. No
No.
in America, anyway. I don't know how the British actually spell it. What were we saying?
In the United States of America, because it is America.
So
That's true.
So what we need to do in terms of those 2 private ones, we're going to provide the property owners with some plaques and help them get their covenants recorded free of charge.
So it's like a conservation easement?
It's a conservation easement.
For the tree.
It's a deed restriction. Yeah, voluntarily.
So those have been nominated, have they been adopted?
They've been adopted by the City Commission. One is on the Clyde Mount House, the big Oregon white oak, and Quercus garryana, if you're interested. And then the other one is big ponderosa pine at the Ainsworth House, which both are just magnificent specimens of trees. So those are the 2 that have been adopted by the City Commission. We do the follow-through work and actually get the plaques installed and get the covenants recorded. But the idea behind the covenant is that it runs with the land. If the property owner changes or passes away, then you will have, at least for the life of the tree,
Runs with the
it
title.
runs with the title. Right. Yeah. And those are voluntary. The way it works on public property is that anybody can make a recommendation to nominate a tree or a grove that's in public right-of-way or in a park, managed by the city, and that recommendation goes up to the City Commission. There are criteria for approval in the code, and that's up on the website here. Tony, maybe bring it up and go through those. The 4 criteria for approval, it's already up if you want to switch over.
Yeah, I was trying to find the video from Arbor Day.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that was clarifying at the last meeting, when we were saying that this or that, I think that
Yeah,
was a really
right.
important point to bring up.
Yeah, so there are 4 criteria. I'll try to do it from memory. The first criterion is that the tree is should be nominated as a heritage grove because of either its size, history, status, something about the tree itself has historical importance. Species, rarity of range, those kinds of things. That's the first one. Or it can be a state-designated tree, heritage tree, which is designated by the Department of Natural Resources, Department of Forest Resources. Or it be a rare species or provide habitat for a rare species of plant, animal, or bird. So those are all ors. And then the final one is an and. So it has to meet either A, B, or C, and not be irreparably damaged, diseased, hazardous, or unsafe, or the applicant who's nominating it was willing to have the tree treated by an arborist to alleviate any problem that's identified with it. So those are the fairly I wouldn't say they're loose criteria, but they do need to be defined a little better, particularly with respect to some of the aspects that the Natural Resources Committee is charged with, which is defining what is rare, defining, what is of habitat importance and those kinds of things. So those are the kind of things.
If we had this, and maybe we did, because I distinctly remember the controversy regarding the Abernathy elm when the state cut it down, and now they have a lovely little plaque there next to the stump, which is over
I
by,
saw that plaque.
Yeah, over by the hotel, Riverview,
Oh, the Riverview. Yeah.
River Shore, excuse me.
So, yeah,
I mean, in that case, though, ODOT would have had to sign on as the property owner.
Right.
Yeah, right. And once a tree is designated and protected, then there are these protections that are defined in the code. It may not be removed, topped, or otherwise altered unless permitted by the section. It allows for routine maintenance, prudent pruning, not topping.
Who's doing all that?
Well, it depends where it is. If it's on private property, it's going to be the responsibility of the homeowner, or the property owner, I mean. And if it's on city property, then it's going to be the city's responsibility. It normally, with respect to public trees, earlier in this code, if you have a tree that is dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous, as verified by a certified arborist, you are permitted to remove it as long as it's replaced according to a ratio of trees in the code according to its diameter. If you're not willing to have an arborist do the work and pay the money to an arborist to have that work done and have it professionally evaluated, then the code provides that you have to plant more trees based on the diameter of the tree that's removed. That's easy to do.
How is that different?
Well,
I mean,
If it's diseased, it's 1-for-1.
1-for-1 tree,
If-
regardless of diameter. Yeah.
right, but I'm just saying, with what you just said, what's different? It's diseased or damaged, so you have an arborist come and certify that it's diseased or damaged, and you have to replace it in accordance to the chart. Or you can just not have an arborist come and you can replace it in accordance with the chart. I mean,
There's different rates. If it's diseased,
If it's diseased, it's one tree for one tree.
Yeah, it seems like
But
if you just want to cut down a tree, and let's say it's 30 inches, you've got to put 8 back.
a big giant tree,
Because you need-
as we know when we were discussing the trees in Library Park, it's kind of hard to say that a bunch of 3-inch diameter trees are going to be a suitable replacement for, something that we can't put our arms around.
Yeah, but there's the unfortunate reality that you can't just, with most species, you can't just move a huge tree
Right.
and replace them. You know, and where were you going to get it anyway?
There is a firm called Big Trees of Oregon.
Yeah, they can get bigger trees.
And their trees are big.
But they can't replace
No, not
a
a,
Not a
4-foot
30-inch.
diameter tree with a,
no,
Yeah, it won't survive, so.
no, it won't.
And,
But
yeah.
you could require, you know, theoretically, you could require replacement with ones like big trees today with.
well, and right now, though, the requirement is just trees. It isn't same species or a deciduous with a deciduous and a, so
Right.
you could end up completely changing the property depending upon
You know, if,
how you replace it.
you know, say if a Oregon white oak fails, and that's on the heritage list, you know, ideally, I would think you would want to put as large as possible Oregon white oak back in.
Depends on what I want. Maybe I want it dead and gone so I can
Yeah.
replace 8 pear trees and start a little pear grove.
You know, if you want to change, you know,
I mean, but that's what could happen.
Sure.
Is you could go from
The
this mature ecosystem to an orchard.
right.
And that would be perfectly valid to do.
So your point is it needs to be further defined?
Yeah, well,
Do you think it's ambiguous? Or?
It's ambiguous, and if we, so therefore we need to at least have the discussion, and if ambiguity is fine,
I think that was what my point was there, is that if you would have a requirement that an Oregon white oak that was significant, say it falls apart in a storm, it's a goner, and at least if you're going to have a heritage tree, start over again, in other words, with the same species.
I think there's another point too, because I think part of it's the purpose, the function that the tree's serving, and if the tree is serving as habitat for rare species, however that's determined, if you go ahead and substitute a white oak, and you have a bunch of pear trees, one of the functions that the tree provides at that site, squirrels like acorns, that kind of thing, and I was saying you have a bunch of pears, or maybe a bunch of raccoons or crows,
Partridges.
whatever, but you won't have the same food community, you won't have the same habitat
Ecosystem.
values if you switch the kind of species at the site. So I think part of the big picture is looking at what values, what functions you're expecting these trees to serve.
I think that is a critical point, Rob. That what was the intent of this code when it was adopted? I'd like to hear some of your perspectives about what you think the intent of this code should be.
Basically, right now, the code basically honors trees, basically what it does, and provides them some protection. That's really the functions it is written to do by my people. We're saying this is a really neat tree, and therefore it deserves a little bit more protection than just your average tree in a yard. And that's really all it does. And but there's, but it does mention these other values. But it doesn't define rare, for instance, which we could easily say, well, let's use the rare and endangered plant list that the state already has, not create or recreate the wheel. That would be the simplest way of doing it, and that's would bring in a lot of expertise from outside the city that's developed that list over decades. So that would be my solution on that one, and then we have something to go by that's concrete and been verified and used by a number of people over the years.
You had mentioned before the meeting started that your committee had developed a marked up version of the code.
Yeah, it was just people were emailing back and forth.
And so do you have a specific list of things that you're proposing to change the
it's a
language?
fairly small list, to tighten up the definition of rare, make a definition, because there is none. And then we talked about, it says the definition of a grove. First thing that I noticed in researching is the word grove is really improper. If you look at the dictionary definition, it's a section of trees with very little undergrowth, which doesn't occur around here very often. So we have plenty of oak undergrowth, especially since our browsing animals are excluded for the most part. Like elk tend to eat the shrubs, and we don't have very many elk around here. anymore, because, you know,
Well, they're just
it's an urban area.
There are a bunch of oaks right there by the mill.
I thought
There is?
they were down on McLaughlin Boulevard.
Yeah, next to the mill.
Eagles.
The Elks Club.
Yeah, the Elk Club, I gathered
I
that.
saw it.
But, so we need to search for a better word and a better definition. The code actually says, with the definitions that back it up, that a grove is defined as trees 20 feet apart. And I did a quick study in Wilderness Park across the river. The trees ran from under 3 feet apart to 55 and averaged about 25 in a natural grove, or not grove, but forest. And so obviously that 20-foot definition doesn't work in a natural habitat. You know, it just,
Well, and how many trees is it a grove? I
Yeah,
mean,
well,
is
it
2
says
trees a
2.
grove?
More than
two,
one.
that's what it says, is 2 trees or more,
Yeah.
which I think is not proper either. It should be more than that, you know, at least 3, so that, you know, there's some dimension to this small forest that we're talking about.
No, I don't think it should be 3 or more. I just think it should be tree or trees. Forget the term grove. I'm not sure what that actually adds, you know, to anything.
What's the term?
Well, trees, you know.
Yeah.
More than one tree. Whatever the grove is,
Yeah.
how they
Copse.
There's actually an archaic word that is perfect, but it's archaic, and, you know, holt actually meant a small, you know, a grove of trees, but without the definition of no undergrowth or limited undergrowth.
How about bunch?
bunch.
Whole bunch, how the whole bunch.
I think it needs to be simplified,
Yeah.
you know, as much
Yeah,
as possible.
everything.
Well, that's true.
And it's like, you know, not worrying about crown width or height or distance between trees necessarily, because that just means somebody's going to have to go out there and do that, and I'm not sure what value it is in the end. So to me, it's either a tree or trees. Now, if you want to call trees a grove, meaning more than one, okay.
Well, it seems that my perception of a grove has always been a group of trees that were in some sort of a pattern,
Yes.
rather than just random trees in the forest. So it seems like if trees don't have significance as individual trees, the only thing that would give them significance as a group of trees is the fact that they had some arrangement or pattern that made them special. And I'm thinking that, you know, there's some parks where the trees were planted in a particular pattern, and as they matured, they became, you know, a recognizable group of trees, and you would see those trees and immediately identify that's a park or a public place,
Central Park or the Olmsted Brothers plan.
as opposed to they're just random trees out there.
Well, but if you go back and look at the criteria, 1A, the tree or grove is of landmark importance to the city of Oregon City due to its age, size, species, horticultural quality, or historic importance. So you could have a pile of trees out there, you know, and maybe it doesn't fit the definition you were kind of talking about, but maybe it has historic importance. Maybe that's where, you know, Mr. Meeker camped or something, I don't know.
But it seems to me that either they would be in a cluster that was recognizable as a group, or some pattern that you would identify.
I don't think we would necessarily have to do that if it's of landmark importance, you know, historic importance of some kind. It could be any assemblage or combination.
I think there's kind of an underlying assumption about the size we're talking about, because I mean, a grove, I mean, at least, you know, what we're looking at when we're at Waterboard, we're talking about a really large, so it's not just a pattern of half a dozen trees or whatever. Well, we're talking about a really big area. So it's almost like if you kind of think of the ecosystem approach and you think kind of like the function or the size, because you know, you could have 3 or 4 trees, but they're different species. Some of them are native, some of them are exotic, and you'd have a mix match, but it doesn't really, it's not cohesive in a functional sense, and it's not even that representative of Oregon natural environment. So I think you have to look at the, there's not really a size limit. maybe you guys have different opinion, there's not a size limitation how big a grove is, or,
No, but one of the questions is, do they have to be heritage trees on their own if they're in a heritage grove to qualify the grove, or whatever we're going to call it? That's another question. But there's that definition you were just speaking of would be great for trees that were planted that way, but then there's groves, or tree groups that could be significant that weren't planted
You're
that
talking
are
about naturally
Yeah,
created.
natural, correct. They could be significant to the city.
Would you see a grove of trees all being one species?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
because more of a natural environment, you're just going to have a distribution of different speed, depending on the site and the elevation.
That's-
I guess what's difficult for staff is trying to understand what the intent of the heritage tree code is. Like, for example, what we struggled with was the entire Waterboard Park was denominated as a grove. Without a study, we don't know what kind of trees are in there. You have extensive ivy, exotic, invasive. So what do we do with that? Was the intent to nominate a whole park as a grove, and does that take away from trying to identify, heritage trees of significance because of their size or their age? That we really did struggle with what to do with Waterboard Park.
Well,
Definitely a complex situation because you've got many trees that would fit the criteria for a heritage trees on its own. You've got firs this thick and so on.
And also the question came up, what is the minimum level of proof or evidence that someone has to provide?
And at the same time, it's an active landslide. That whole park is, or not the whole park, but good sections of it are moving slowly over the years, and trees are leaning, which by themselves would imply that they might be dangerous, but, they're still part of this park.
And at the same time, they're holding the land in place with their root system,
Right.
so
Well,
they are a strategic value. Well, yeah.
There's places where the ground is dropped 6 feet straight down, and the whole landscape is sort of pushing
slumping.
downhill. Yeah, and raising the ground up and shielding the trees. There's a place where there's a mound cutting across asphalt, so that the asphalt is mounded up and cracked, creviced because of that, and then the trees on that section that's moving are going like this on either side. So there's an interest in nominating it as an area of special geologic interest, actually, because it's a great example because of the paved road, especially. You can easily see what's going on because of that road that loops across.
Well, I can see where it would be much more straightforward to evaluate an individual tree as meeting criteria or not.
Right.
Once you get into a group of trees,
Yeah, there's going to be trees that do and trees that don't.
it becomes more subjective.
Right. And there was some interest in defining a group of trees as, in terms of canopy. There's a scientific definition. If it's 80% coverage, it's a forest. If it's under a certain percentage, it's savanna, and so on, or woodland. There's several different terms that are used in the scientific community.
Well, and I guess I was on the commission when all this was being talked about and getting started.
Yeah, you
But-
may be able to fill us in there.
Well, no, because there was just the same amount of debate going on with the commission. And to me, what I recall of the discussion and what I personally believe, it was the whole idea of, individual trees. I don't think anybody really has too much of an issue with. I mean, it was the Abernathy elm. It was, all the trees in front of the McLaughlin house now are to a large extent, they're in front of the McLaughlin house, even though it's not the original site, but they're, large caliber. The trees around the library. And there was a big move, I think, a lot of impetus was about saving those trees. Let's designate them so that, to a large extent, so that the city has to spend more money to try to save them rather than just go with a solution of, Dutch elm, and we'll put a dogwood tree in there and it's the same thing and we're done. That was what a lot of the furor was that I was hearing. As far as groves, I don't think there was any envisionment of plopping entire, I mean, it's a park. It already has a level of preservation that's happening. To plop an entire park's worth of trees in the process, I don't think was ever envisioned. There's a clump of white oak, great. There's a clump of, ponderosa pine, yeah, great. But wall to wall was never. I mean, especially in a park, because, like I said, the park already has some preservation in it.
Right. That's quite a bit, especially the
Yeah.
charter parks. And I did have some questions of whether it's really going to change anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the part that's on the Public Works site, that was, I could see trying to preserve that. Unfortunately, there's some other side issues about, if we make it all, then we can't do any work up there. But other locations where we've got facilities, none of the fire stations have significant development around them or growth around them right now. But
South Fork does.
I'm talking about the fire station.
Fire station.
But yeah, in South Fork, the water treatment plant has a forest. I mean, there's probably.
I can live next door, actually.
Yeah, so there's like 40 mature, pine trees or fir trees or whatever, evergreens. And like, for instance, where I live up by the old high school, there is probably a 150-foot oak tree that's growing there, because it's about a third of the way up the slope on my side, and it goes up.
There's a huge amount of trees that could qualify.
Yeah.
That's really true.
But if you went down the whole canyon, you would probably find, I think, a good 80% of that canyon would qualify. But I don't think there's any, I don't know anybody that wants to take responsibility for saying, there's a canyon, you can't touch it, and we have to go in and have arborists treat the trees. It's a natural area.
Well, I don't think anybody's going to develop it either, because it's in steep slopes and
Sure,
there's
but
no hazards.
but should we ever decide, that we want to put trails in it, I can see where some people are going to go, well, you can't put a trail there because you have to cut this one tree down in order to, but that's, the tree that I used to climb when I was a kid, and so it meets the criteria. So, and that's the canyon I used to run. I mean, shoot, half the trail, well, if you could find any of them left, I probably cut. And yeah, the old machete, just going at it. Oh, that tree's in the way. Oh, look, we have a bridge over the creek. Yeah, that's me. But that's part of my heritage. And I'd love to have the next generation be able to have that same heritage of doing these things. Now they'd probably go stick a whole bunch of M80s in and blow the tree over. But so to me, I think, especially you as the first level gatekeepers on this. I mean, staff gets the things, but your committee is the one that's the common sense check, and I really hope that you can come up with some common sense to what could be a wild and crazy policy if people want to do that. And there's people that will do that.
Tony, I was wondering if you could go back maybe a little bit, because I think there's enough people here that either don't remember. What I'm remembering in my brain is that there was some controversy about some trees, and we didn't have any sort of a tree ordinance, is what I'm remembering, but I can't remember anything. I mean, I don't think we need details, but
I
that's
think
what
it was
I'm remembering.
the development up next to the new high school, wasn't it, when they clear cut it? Yeah. There's some mature trees, and they just went for 4 square blocks.
We moved from very limited tree protection to what we said was we came up with a replacement schedule for trees that were moved, for example, on a subdivision. If a tree was located in a future right-of-way, an easement, Or for example, if we do a 10,000 square foot lot, we have setbacks, 20 in the back, 15 on the front, 7 and 7. So if it was in one of those setback areas, you had to mitigate for it. If it was in the building footprint area, you didn't have to mitigate it. So what we ran into out at Sequoia, out by the high school, was those were all 2,000 square foot lots. So you got 0 setbacks, you got 5 in the front and 10 in the back, which meant 90-some% of those trees fell within an area that didn't have to be mitigated for.
It's ironic that it's called Sequoia, too.
Yeah.
Well, that's a real common thing, you know, so name it after the stuff you take out.
Yeah. So in response to that, we then created that every tree, whether it's in the right of way or not, had to be mitigated for. It was just at a different schedule. Because obviously we have transportation, PED requirements for connectivity in streets. So the threshold for trees that were located in those areas where they weren't previously required to be mitigated, now we're mitigated, but at a lower threshold than trees that potentially could be saved through grading of the site or housing location. You have flexibility to move the setback of the home to save a tree. So we wrote all that in response to Sequoia. But you still see Thayer Road was another example. We're just running into these 3,500 square foot lots. They're small setbacks, and the hard part there is this is once again that urban-rural interface that we have to. It's a challenge. Is that was I think at that point it was a tree farm. It was in forestry under Clackamas County. It was its second or third growth. It had been harvested, and the property owner just as she aged, just let it go. So you had hundreds and hundreds of trees that were never thinned. So what they ended up doing was growing very quickly with and they became very top heavy. They were very thin relative to where the crown of the tree was. And then, the concern was, and what the arborist found was, once you start cutting into that, you increase the wind blow down for these trees that were on the interior, which is a safety hazard. And so that then created that second round, of which you guys kind of dealt with one of those first meetings with Jerry and Thayer Road subdivision that's going in out there, because they just cut that recently. They're mitigating per the standards. Our tree code actually does provide exceptions for properties that were in timber. If they come in and show that I've got the tax deferral from Clackamas County, we're managing it for this, we allow flexibility. We ran into the same thing on Pease Road. We did a subdivision out there, but it was a Christmas tree farm. We didn't get the uproar, but they took out probably just as many trees. But it was an active Christmas tree farm, and what do? The guy's taking out 600 Christmas trees that provide practically no habitat, realistically, natural habitat.
Those are a commercial crop, actually.
Well, but the same thing can be said for the Doug fir that's planted for timber. And so those were the hard ones, and those are the ones that kind of got everyone understandably concerned.
Yeah.
And
It really kind of depends on where they are. My in-laws have grow Christmas trees, but we've also discovered that it's providing habitat out there. But they're in a rural area, and there's all sorts of little critters and things that weren't there before they were planted and started growing up, and now they are.
Yeah, but the flip side is if habitat becomes the overriding thing, then I'm going to stop mowing my lawn because it's habitat, and I don't care if it gets 3.5 feet and it's a fire hazard, because there are mice and things growing there that would not have been there, and
You're going to have to come up with a 3-toed frog or something to be significant. So,
but I'm just saying that's if it's a commercial site and it's documented as a commercial site, that's the overriding definition of the site.
No reason to cut them down. I'm just saying that habitat sort of
habitat
moves around.
My house is a habitat for about 7 different species of ants right now, and I'm bombing the crap out of them. I don't care what any of you say.
That's on the record.
Yes.
But
I guess the one thing is that we've come a long way in terms of, and now you can't make a finding that we can't fit it on the site. Now, if you can't fit it on the site, you work with us to identify areas to plant it off-site, whether it be storm ponds, wetland areas, other locations in parks. If you don't want to do that, we have a fee. And you pay us, it goes into a tree fund that then we utilize for Arbor Day or, other plantings throughout the area.
So
So,
we get a new park that's a field, then we want to put it in.
right, so I mean, those are, just with the slowdown in development, you don't see a whole lot of that right now being implemented, but it is in place. So I think we've come a long way.
We've got to just step up to the bar and realize that growth is going to cost us. And this lady that came in tonight about the traffic, okay, that's the cost of growth. Unless people want to give up their cars and stuff like that. And all that it takes to solve these problems is money. That's all it takes. Just throw money at it, get a bigger highway and more stop signs and safer this and that. But growth is going to cost us, which leads me to my next question. If you identify these costs, by identifying these trees, has anybody made an effort or talked about the possibility of inventorying these trees or these groves to give us a starting point as to what we're thinking about here, the location of these things and the type? Because I'm trying to keep up. Where are these things? What are you guys talking about in terms of geography? And a map is a great way to get your get your message out.
Yeah, I think some of the bigger municipalities around have made at least a start in that direction, but I don't think Oregon City has done a lot at this point in time.
We talked about that when we were doing the updates, and, if we were to, basically, if you're going to protect trees by ordinance, without inventorying them or knowing where they are, you're starting to run a risk. Because you can't enforce the ordinance that you've adopted.
Well,
because you don't know where they are.
It's an unfunded mandate.
It's an unfunded mandate.
Because somebody's got to maintain it. And when you start telling people that you've got to protect that tree, then somebody's got to take responsibility for it.
So there are ways to do it.
What about utilizing the same thing that we did back in the earlier when we were starting to update our historic inventories? You start out with a windshield survey, and we were able to get volunteers in each of the neighborhoods, several people who would go out and drive around in their area, and maybe there's something that the Natural Resource Committee could be the sponsor of, utilizing the network of neighborhood associations to say, okay, we're going to give you this area and we want you to go out, not get on somebody's private property, but if it's a tree, you could see it from the right of way and say, okay, I think I saw a such and such, and then you go back and you get at least a windshield type survey, and then you go back and start really honing in on it. But that's a way that it could be done very inexpensively without a lot of cost, but you have utilize volunteers and manpower.
But I guess my one question there is to what are we trying to accomplish by doing
It's
that?
basically what
Is that a
what
tree
Rob
code?
said. It's basically knowing kind of what's out there.
You've
Yeah,
got
it's an
to
inventory.
have information. Once you've got information that you can communicate to people, they're going to say, "Oh, now I see what you're talking about." So,
Yeah,
See, like an
I
inventory
understand
tree
it's
as
gonna
opposed to
cost.
historic sectors.
Yeah, and then you have to define the scope of that tree inventory. Is it going to be limited to public right-of-way trees? Is it alleys? Is it,
It's everywhere. I think you do it everywhere.
Well, that's a decision that needs to be made because that changes the cost of that inventory significantly.
Pete, I think two things. One thing, the whole idea of the rare species, getting back to your overgrown grass and things, it may provide some habitat. If we're talking about a few more raccoons or possums wandering around or whatever that doesn't seem
We've
like
actually got
shorts or
deer.
skunks. But even deer too. I think when we're getting kind of a working definition of what rare oak savanna, because of what it takes to kind of maintain that site, is kind of demonstrated unusual habitat for the area and things. And so defining rare and having kind of consensus of what list we're using for that provides kind of a scientific basis for, kind of evaluating habitat and seeing what you're looking at. But if we don't figure out what we want to use rare for or what it means, you just don't have any place to go from. You don't have a foundation.
Yeah, I agree with you. To me, the definition needs to be such that you're not identifying every tree. if the definition is so broad that every tree fits the definition, then that's too broad. And, you know, I think, like I said earlier, it's easy to identify a single individual tree that meets your criteria if you've established a pretty good criteria. I think it's when you get into that group of trees or grove or whatever you want to label it. I like what Damon said, is that if it's in an established park, it probably doesn't necessarily need any additional protection if it's in a place that is considered a protected environment anyway, unless it has some historic significance or it's a rare tree or rare habitat.
Well, Charles, we only have a few charter parks, and I think that they're the exception, not the rule, and other parks are not charter parks. So I think that they are not necessarily, in my mind, would necessarily be protected. Because what about all the trees that are in Mountain View Cemetery? I mean, I know that's it's not a charter park in any sense, but there are some very large trees as you start to go down the slopes there, and then once you get into the undeveloped area, I mean, to me, that's more like a forest, but there are significant trees in that cemetery.
But why are they significant?
I think because they're very large, for one thing, and they may have, for some reason, they may have survived the removal during the time when the cemetery was the most active. But they add to sort of the ambiance, and I was thinking about Lone Fir when I was there just about 2 weeks ago, and the trees in there date back to, the beginning of when that cemetery was designated and donated to the city. So, I mean, if all of those were to be gone, the cemetery would still maintain its status, but I don't think it wouldn't be the same without that.
I think going back to what Charles was saying, I know when we were writing this, what I envisioned was that this was to showcase special trees. And so, what I wonder is it too broad? I mean, nominating Doug firs just because they're big? I mean, is that the story we want to tell through this program? Because this is supposed to be, this isn't meant to be a regulatory tool. It was private property owners saying, this tree has been here. It's a white oak. It's a beautiful tree. But just to say, I think we have some categories of minimums, for white oaks and then other, as long as it's bigger than X. It's almost like the diameter became the driver or the gatekeeper. And does that need to be rethought of? Are we really trying to target special specimen trees, or is the intent really to nominate trees just because they're large regardless of species?
It depends on where they are and whether you can document it. I know that there are pictures going back to 1909 of some of the trees that still remain in the park that the McLaughlin House is in. So are they significant because of the trees in themselves? And I'd say yes to an extent, but because it was in a park that was dedicated by our founder, they were there when he dedicated it, so maybe there's significance. Just, again, I'm equating a lot of this to preservation. Because there's some significant event that took place there, there's some significant building or is associated with somebody. So maybe there are similar types of things that, these individual trees have. I know we know trees all over the city and the county that we can say, oh yeah, we know that was planted by, Mr. Ermitinger, or we know maybe this was on Abernathy's place, or this is from such and such and such. So, there are those sorts of things that I think the community at large is aware of to some extent, and then there might need to be research with regard to others if you've got photo documentation or you were able to document that, this tree has been here. But I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think it should be every tree.
Right.
But again, we've now completed an inventory pretty much of the city of Oregon City with historic property. So we know the buildings that are significant and the ones that aren't. And I think a tree inventory, if we establish some parameters, could do something very similar. Again, even if I'm just walking down Washington Street and I say, oh, look, there's a this and there's a this and there's, this. But at least it could be mapped, you could know what it is, and you could say, well, is that significant or not? And maybe it isn't.
So at least, so what I'm hearing is you kind of do hear a difference between, we've got 2 trees, same species, same size, but one is on McLaughlin, next to McLaughlin House, and there's a story there, there's a history that can be documented, versus one that's up in Park Place, just randomly placed with,
Could be, yeah.
you know,
And
let's just say we researched
Yeah.
it and there's no history.
Yeah.
You would, in your opinion, you could see a difference between
Yes,
those
I
two.
could, yeah.
But the way I think our code's written, is
It'd be
both of
nom-
those could be
Significant,
nominated,
yeah.
right?
I mean, in Park Place, if we knew it was on the Livesey homestead, and we know that that tree was there since, you know, Livesey.
Right, but, you know.
Again, but then there could be one on the corner of Holcomb and whatever, and, well, we don't know what that was, but maybe we,
Well,
so,
Yeah, there's probably, history does get lost in some cases. Nobody remembers or nobody really ever knew.
In Kanema, you've got all the Native American sites, and there's just not the documentation the same way you have for
But
the.
in a way, there's 2 different, we can say our ancestors planted this 120 years ago, therefore it's significant, or we could say our ancestors didn't cut this tree down 120 years ago, therefore it's significant.
It survived this long.
yeah, what happened?
I mean, I've got 300-year-old apple trees on my property, but, they're not listed
Maybe
anywhere.
your property was some sort of significant orchard.
They've actually.
I don't know, but I'm cutting them down.
Up in Vancouver,
That solves the problem.
they've actually put apple trees on a historic register because they were planted way back, 1840 or something.
Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah.
Don't laugh. My in-laws have some trees left over from the first commercial prune orchard that was established in Clackamas County on their property.
I think with the large trees, at some point, someone still has to nominate it. So,
Right.
I mean, I think that's the initial barrier. That's going to really clear us from having to nominate
And
every
nobody's
tree.
proposing somebody go out and nominate every tree, and we've only had 3 proposals so far, and it's not like we're being buried in proposals.
But we did have a Grove nomination, which was
Yeah,
very broad.
right, and that's really a big part of what the motivation we have this meeting.
Right.
Because of,
And you think too, if you think, because I know a lot of this had to do with cultural, historical, but since one of the criteria has to do with habitat for rare species, we almost need some kind of documentation background of linking these particular nominated trees to rare habitat. So you have to have documentation of what kind of species are related back to the tree, and that's another information gap we don't have.
Yeah, and whether or not it's an incidental habitation. I mean, there's an osprey that flies around, and if he happens to land for 2 weeks, and you take a picture of him in the tree, but then he disappears for, it's like a tree is an osprey habitat. There's no nest, so
But sometimes they do come back over and over again.
yeah, they won't when the tree's gone. But
yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I do like your suggestion about having the list of rare trees that's already been established and adopted,
Right.
because you're not just starting from ground zero.
Right.
You're
Well,
taking an
there's-
established list.
Yeah, there is an established list that, that everybody follows. Basically, every habitat specialist or person inventorying a site for development has to look for those plants. They do it before logging. That's the same list for everybody.
That's a good idea.
Tony,
Now
is
now
that
you're getting
something-
specific.
Is that
Right.
something we could incorporate into the code by reference rather
Yes.
than putting the whole thing in there?
Yes.
And that would take care of criterion C, or at least help to flesh out criterion C.
Yeah, it's online. You could look it up.
Does that list take into consideration the different, obviously, I'm assuming it's more than one page,
Oh,
because it
yeah.
would have to take into consideration the different habitats around the state, because obviously.
Well, it's done basically on rarity, how much of it is out there. If there's, 6 salamanders in one pond, it's on this list. If there's 6 salamanders in every pond in the state, it's not. So,
But I think there's a different point. The question is whether or not it's rare for the immediate area, or it's rare
That's
statewide, or
statewide,
regional.
yeah.
So that's,
Then you start getting really detailed, but it does recognize to an extent, it's only growing on this side of the state, it's only growing on the eastern side. So there's stuff listed that we don't have to worry about because it only grows in,
there's
Hawaii
Some bird out on
county
the
or
coast that
something.
only habitat is in this very
Well,
defined area.
there may be cases where it only grows in oak habitat, I'm pretty sure that's the case, and it's a much less common habitat than Douglas fir, which, is so widespread.
Well, I'd like to suggest
It's
that
a
we
great
contact
concern.
every D8 Caterpillar driver in the state. Because he's the last guy that gets the word. He's the guy that pushes over the heritage tree. Nobody told me.
Or backs into it and scores it bad enough with his foot that,
Yeah, there's,
I'm not sure the list you're talking about is really the best way to go, because it's like 2 or 3 or 4 years old.
well, yeah.
And the up-to-date lists are the federal lists of threatened and endangered
You can use
species
that
and
then.
or state.
That can be used,
Yeah.
instead of the state one. I just found that one and I
Yeah.
wanted to get the idea in there,
Yeah.
and, but, yeah, those do get changed from time to time.
it would be interesting to know there's a significant applicable difference between the two lists for this area.
There wouldn't be a huge difference, but there are differences.
Well, in either case, it seems like that would be a fairly simple thing to just
Sure.
add to this criteria a reference to
Yeah,
whatever
because-
list was appropriate.
I don't think
For
anybody
reference.
wants to put in the energy of creating their own list of rare plants,
Yeah.
or-
And it could be as simple as just saying the current list by that name,
Yeah,
so
sure.
you don't have to give it a date, it just automatically gets updated as the list is updated.
Yeah, it's all published somewhere online, and we can reference
Can I
that.
suggest an amendment to B? Because the county now has a heritage tree list, and I would think that we would want to add the county or state heritage tree, because if we get an area that gets annexed and there's a heritage tree on it, and we don't have it on that as far as B,
That's a good idea.
that we should definitely add that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I talked to Lorraine Gonzalez in the county about their program, and they've got a lot of heritage trees designated. And they did them all at once.
Yes.
So,
Did they go out and act proactively and
No,
Okay.
they
No.
had people nominate them.
they
Okay.
had nominations similar to us, yeah.
Well, what if the
a
person,
map? Because if you think of annexation,
They've got,
nice.
yeah, they've got a really good map that they just put up on their website, which is interactive. And how that would work if those trees were brought into the city limit during the Goal 5 inventory for any concept planning, they would automatically become part of the Goal 5 analysis. So that's how they would do it.
Similar to a landmark, like a
Yeah.
historic landmark.
Yeah.
what if a person has on their property a tree that would legitimately qualify? And
Yeah.
they don't make any effort to nominate it. And as a result, it's threatened, it could be cut down, am I right?
that's true.
And so, who takes the initiative there if you get into a sort of a limbo?
Part of it is that it's required that the landowner that owns the tree is cooperating in the effort. If they don't want it on the list, it doesn't go on the list, according to the way it's written right now.
It's voluntary. It's very similar to right now, if you have a home that qualifies as that could go on the historic list as a landmark, but the property owner needs to consent. So we're not out there looking to nominate trees.
So
on
all of
private
this is
property.
strictly voluntary?
This is all, that's why I go back with the intent of
The
this
public
was.
could nominate something in the public right of way. though.
Right, and
Yeah,
and
public right away.
I like that balance, because on the one hand, I think everybody is on board with the concept of protecting trees, especially significant trees, but, we're still living in a country up to today that was a free country, and property rights, private property
Yeah.
rights need to be respected.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning that, I think dictating that your tree on your property needs to be protected is stepping beyond the intent of this code.
And it doesn't do that right now.
But you know, maybe part of the whole thing though is, in a sense, kind of marketing the benefits, because people, you know, I think it's pretty well demonstrated that properties that have mature trees on were more valuable than equal properties without large trees. And so if there was a potential heritage tree on private property, maybe a simple case of educating the property owner to the benefits of this designation, you know, through whatever value systems applicable or wherever they're coming from. Because I think there needs to be some kind of, why would a private property owner want
Exactly.
this designation on the property?
And like Denise was saying, they've identified potential historic buildings throughout the city, and by giving people the education of why that building is significant, then maybe hand in hand with that some incentive for giving it the historic designation works.
And really, yeah, there's no doubt that public education always helps.
Sure.
Each situation is very different, because you could have a very, very large tree that's in very, very poor health, or is potentially just what one person may perceive as a nuisance, the owner may perceive as a nuisance, and then, you know, that's where we run into this difficulty. Is that maintenance and upkeep short term as compared to the long-term benefit of keeping the tree, which can be demonstrated through public education. So, yeah, I think that's what we're running into.
One suggestion I have about the whole inventory question is there's two sources of volunteers that the city, I think, could tap into, even if it's just to deal with the public areas, and that's the Eagle Scouts. They're always looking for something.
I have a good contact for them.
And the high school, the seniors all need their senior capstone thing. And if it's, you know, walk this grid and write down what you see on the public right-of-ways, and, you know, and do an inventory of a, you know, 1 square mile area or whatever. I mean, you know, or develop, you know, the survey sheet, you know, so that, you know here, you know, here's what you're looking for when you're walking around, and maybe they don't walk around, the other person does, you know, whatever. So, I mean, those are two really good sources of renewable volunteers. Yeah.
I guess I appreciate that. I'm going to be perfectly blunt, is that we don't have an urban forester. We don't have a forestry program.
Right.
You know, I think that's an excellent resource. I would hate to utilize that resource and then do nothing with it, which is what's going to happen at this point.
Right.
Because I think that, you know, when we start talking about this, you know, our first goal was, okay, let's get Arbor Day going. You know, let's have our activity. Let's meet our minimum requirements for investment, capital investment. Let's get our tree code in place. And then the next step is the public education component. And that's kind of where this heritage tree kind of formed from, was, you know, can we get the private sector, private property owners to nominate trees, take ownership of why these trees are important, start telling that story. You know, then the next step, you know, as you move towards, you don't go from no regulation to let's regulate every tree in the city and require you to get a tree permit.
Right.
You know, we'll just get land-based it.
That's what Durham did. They have a really strong ordinance, but they just went kaboom, that's the way it's going to be. And the people love it, actually.
The city of Durham?
City of Durham. They have one of the strongest tree protection. You don't cut down a tree.
More than like Oswego?
It's close. I couldn't give you a hard and fast comparison, but basically they depend on the citizens to enforce the tree codes, and they do.
You know, I know the city's operating under resource constraints, but are some ways to kind of weak. When I was at the Johnson Creek Watershed Council, we wanted to get a oral history of the watershed, and we had a whole capstone program, undergraduate class. We had 2 instructors and 9 students, spent 1,700 hours collecting, compiling, and putting together a whole document. And if you got down to OSU's forestry program, get some graduate students, actually kind of design the program and provide field supervision for the volunteers. I know the city doesn't have a volunteer coordinator and staff have limited time, but I think there's a way you could bring the entire project where graduate students with faculty supervision could really take this whole thing out and have the volunteers reporting to the graduate students. I mean, you'd have to plan it far enough in advance that it would get into the curriculum and you get the students to sign up for it. And I'd be glad to provide some technical assistance on that, but I think it's really doable. It's just, I guess it has to be commitment. You want to do it and just frame it out and set up the criteria, just present it to, Portland State's got the capstone program, OSU's got the forestry program. It just depends on who wants to partner up and what the city's commitment and support or helping them get started would be. It's doable.
But I guess then once again, though, what do you
you
what's
have
the
an
intent
inventory
to
that
do
collects
with that
stuff.
information?
Well, that's what you have to set the parameters up. I think before you present it, but that'd be up to the city to decide what the parameters are. But as far as carrying out the research or discussing the findings or presenting
That's
it,
to do that.
Well, the inventory sounds like a useful thing to a certain point, but to make that inventory meaningful, there has to be a way of evaluating it. And that's where the time element really coming in is you can have, page after page after page of documentation of what you got out there. But until you do some due diligence to figure out what it means, and especially if you're going to try to tie any historic significance to it, somebody other than a student is going to have to take the lead on that with some, the wherewithal to actually assign that tree was part of somebody's, heritage farm or something like that.
I mean, regardless of the Heritage Tree Code, a tree inventory is a basic part of any urban forest management plan.
Yeah.
So I think you have to start at the beginning and then take the next step to decide, well, what do we actually have here? If we find out in our inventory that we have a, preponderance of, fifth growth Douglas firs, because we know this whole area is to all be treed, and then it got whacked down many times. But, there still may be some elements of that old
Well, or
Oregon City
just
that
finding out that
might be there.
85% of our Doug firs are bigger than.
Right.
Well, okay, maybe we need to change that diameter then.
Exactly.
Yeah,
we don't know.
Or maybe we just need to
won't know
strike
until
it
we-
because 90% of our trees are Doug fir.
Yeah.
So basically, inventory project, basically you have to figure out what do you want, what's the
What do you want
priority to
to
know, what's the.
What do we
Yeah.
have?
Yeah, what do you have?
And do, for this, urban reforestry is different from this,
Right, it's-
At what point do we need an inventory like that? This is voluntary, we're not going to send out letters, I don't think, to people suggesting they nominate their trees.
Right.
Well, I
So
think
what-
what
what's
Denise
the
is
purpose of the
suggesting,
inventory?
maybe we start with just trees that are only in the public area, and maybe you even become more focused than that. You take a section of the city. You don't try to just hit the whole city, but you say we're going to focus on this part of the city first. Maybe you say we're going to do the McLaughlin neighborhood first. And get that done.
That's one way that's suggested to do it from
Yeah.
community tree management inventory is to focus on wards or precincts or neighborhoods first.
And then you can tie that in with what Dane was talking about, where you get a group of scouts or students and say, okay, we're just going to survey this 12-block area. And you don't have to survey the whole city, just block by block in the public area, what do you find?
And then it's replicable.
And this is what we're looking for?
Well, it could be.
I guess, like I said, I support all of the ideas. I think they're great ideas. I think that the problem is that, while it's great, we can go out and get volunteers to do it, it is still a commitment on staff to manage, run, and implement, and it's not small. And the problem being that, once again, I go back to, if we really want to do a urban forest management plan, you need someone to run it.
And that's kind of what we're talking about.
Right. And so, I mean, it's great to have the info. I just hate expending the energy and the resources and then not be able to follow through on that to implement. And it seems like we're more coordinated if this is a priority, it gets on the city commission goals, they dedicate funds for it, for us to do it properly.
I do know that there's people in the city that would like to see that sort of program get established, but it hasn't been funded yet. And we need someone who's the city forester or ecologist, whatever you want to define the role as, to help implement this sort of process. And we're not, that hasn't happened yet as far as the funding. And that's something that needs some public support. People say, we'd like to see this happen, and tell the city council that.
And when did we implement, so for, like right now, you do have to come in and get a right-of-way permit and a tree removal permit if you're taking out a tree in the right-of-way. What's your time on that?
Oh, now that we've narrowed it down to a pretty streamlined process, every permit that comes in is probably, it takes about 4 or 5 hours a week doing street trees.
Just street tree. We thought this would be simple, you're just going to not take that tree out, but all of a sudden you're getting arborist reports, you have to review the arborist report. Some go to code enforcement, unfortunately, because they've gone in, cut down a tree, and neighbors turned them in. It's amazing how much energy actually does go into implementing these programs. We really thought the tree replacement of street trees was, 15-minute over-the-counter thing, no big deal.
Nothing
It
is
doesn't
free.
happen that way.
Nothing is free.
Just for your inventory of the trees in Oregon City, automatically you think people out in the field, they have to be good at what they're doing, and you automatically think about GIS capabilities that information is going to be converted to. And eventually, that leads to a lot of other things, and all of a sudden you got a $500,000 a year program.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it leads to.
There's still some alternative. There's the RARE program where you can get some really qualified, motivated, educated people to get some work done. If you check the Idealist website and see
17,
all the jurisdictions and the positions they're recruiting for Metro, City. There's a lot of things that are getting done. Well, I would have a full FTE with full benefits, retirement, and PERS, and whole 9 yards. So I guess what I'd ask, the city kind of look creatively of how to stack. We know resources are limited and budgets and priorities, but it doesn't have to be either or, full-time permanent employee or nothing, because we can't afford it.
No, I know. And with RARE, I signed up to be a RARE volunteer, but ended up doing something else. Yeah, it takes a match by the city, so there needs to be some grant writing program and somebody who's writing grants, right. So I think it's about 18 grand. It's the local match, and then the other.
Is that hard or soft?
I don't know.
Well, it also seems like
I think it's hard.
If there was a way to tie that in, either with the Clackamas Community College or Portland State, where somebody that was not necessarily on city staff could serve maybe a part-time role in coordinating some of the inventory and that type of
With the Capstone program, 2 instructors are already working for Portland State, and Johnson Creek's out-of-pocket expenses was simply making copies of the final document and my staff time. It was really, we leveraged maybe 100 hours of my time for 17 hours of instructor and student time.
1,700.
1,700.
You said 17.
Are we going to have enough time to see the videos?
It's short.
Oh, it's short?
It's pretty short.
we should probably
make
wrap
a
this up.
comment on Waterboard Park, I think, since we've been talking about it. I think we as a Natural Resources Committee are still trying to find our way in terms of our agenda, other than what we're talking about now, and also find our way in terms of the voting process, and how we evaluate things that come to us. And I believe that we had some difficulties, with the application, because I spent half my life on Corps of Engineer applications for water resource development projects, in the consulting business. And I think I know a complete application when I see one, although I'm not in the planning business, I'm not a planner, but I know a complete application. And I don't believe the application that we saw was complete. I thought it did not have the level of information needed to go through the criteria and make a rational decision. So how do you...
And that's what makes this difficult, is that this isn't in the land use section, it's not a land use decision. You
Yeah.
know, like if we came into land use, we have our completeness list, and we go through and we go, oh, look, you're missing the tree inventory.
Yeah.
You know, this was, like I said, the intent of this was that it was supposed to be, you know, almost like feel good. You know, oh, this private property owner has this beautiful tree, and we're going to come in, and we didn't foresee the situation that we ran into right off the bat. And it's hard when it's on public property, a citizen's nominating it. You know, how do I say to them, go get a $8,000 arborist report for the trees? You know, there's nothing in the code that says I can just say I will not accept this. You know, it does say that, but on public property, when a citizen's realistically, you know, we're going to run it, and that's where it makes it hard. That made it very difficult for us and you.
Yeah, this was actually the neighborhood association up there that proposed it. And it got attached. One fellow put it in, and his name got attached to it, but it was actually the whole neighborhood association.
But how do
We
you...
never had that in the writing in the record.
Now, how- when you pass it
And there's
on
no
to the
record
city
because it's not
commission,
land use.
there will have to be additional information supplied, is that correct or not?
Well, once again, it's kind of like it's not as clear as I think we all would have liked it to have been. It got very complicated, and that was never the intent.
Okay.
You know, especially when you're nominating, you know, Waterbury Park, which is how many acres? You know, we have no idea how many trees are there, where they're at.
Well, and I guess the question I would just throw out for you to consider is, would it make sense to eliminate the terminology for groves, and rather than considering groves, just consider trees or groups of trees?
That would help, but, you know, there are 4 criteria here, and the way the staff report was written, you couldn't support any of the criteria.
I mean, our recommendation was not to do it. Yeah.
No, you didn't make a recommendation.
That was an
No, see, that was the other part of it. See, you read this and you read the staff response, and it's like, I think they're saying there's not enough information. I mean, I know that's what you're saying. But then I was looking for a conclusion, you know, on the next page, like the conclusion is, you know, but there wasn't a conclusion. But yet.
And that's because they couldn't come to one.
I mean, you're in the same boat as you know, anything else that's occurring without precedent. I mean, you, to a large extent, you're setting, with the decisions you make, you're setting the standard. And if it's a scribble on the back of a napkin with all sorts of ebonics or hillbillyisms or whatever you want to call it, and because it's an ordinary citizen who doesn't need to be an attorney, who's, you know, because it's a feel-good thing, you know, and that's the standard that you set, then, you know, that's the standard. If it's, we need you to identify in your application specifically which of these 4 things you're doing and provide at least, you know, your interpretation of how it does that without lawyering it up, then that's the standard you're setting. If it's, and please provide an arborist report, you know, I don't think you could go there, because then you're imposing an economic sanction on anybody who's applying.
Well, but that does make it difficult. You know, especially with these ones where anyone can walk in and nominate one on public property.
Yeah, well,
How much? What's our bar? Minimum threshold.
Yeah, what's going to happen when someone does nominate one that's dead and dying, but they think it's significant and they nominate it? You know,
The city
who's going to
And
do the
they're not
arborist?
going to do the arborist report. We're actually running into that right
get
now.
one teed up for you right
And
now.
I'm spending money, city money, because one arborist says it's fine, another arborist says it's dead and dying, it's a hazard. Okay, and we just went through this whole thing, you know, so I'm paying
property
money.
owner is responsible for it, and the other property owner across the street wants to nominate it as a heritage tree. Literally.
I mean, I think that if we had more of these under our belt and we had these conversations of, you know, if I knew that the Natural Resource Committee is going to go, there's not enough information here, I can convey that to the applicant and go, look, you didn't even identify a tree.
Yeah.
They're not going to consider this, you know, but we just, like I said, that one was right out of the gate. You know, we hadn't had this process before, and I think that this is good, trying to get this feedback on how do you make, I mean, we were struggling, you saw what we wrote, we were struggling with it.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to tell applicants, I understand, I believe what you're trying to do, but based on this, I'm not comfortable dealing with it. If you came back with more X, Y, or Z, we'd be happy to, look at it again. I mean, we've done that. City Commission's done that. Planning Commission's done that. And it's,
when we approved it, I did say to them that they should write up their reasons in more detail, because they just had, a little short thing. And because we're only recommending to the city council that they take a good look at it, and with the assumption that they will look at the evidence and lack of evidence in this case and make their decision.
Are you sending a recommend approval or
we recommend
a
approval.
Check review?
Well,
because
it's really both.
Well, I mean,
Because
I believe the intent is you should be saying thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah,
And
we said thumbs up, basically, but, part of that was because these people had been basically,
There's a timeline.
there's a timeline that had been going on since last year.
oh yeah.
And they either needed to go to, if we would have asked for more information, it would have been months again, which is getting unreasonable. And that was part of our problem.
Plus, we were getting pressure that we're taking too long to make the decision anyhow. I mean, there's some feedback we got from the audience, when we spoke up, was why you guys taking so long.
But that's no reason to approve something if there's not sufficient information to prove it.
Yeah.
And frankly, this is one I think we should have punted. No decision, but pass it on,
Pete, would you send Damon and I that, just so you know, we have a little bit of a conflict. We're both on the executive board of the McLaughlin Neighborhood Association, and we did vote to submit the application, but to be honest with you, I never saw what was submitted.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I think that would be very helpful to us based on your comments. We're putting on our other hat.
Well, and this is really, we're focused on trees right now, but it's a very common problem that I face as an architect. We're constantly dealing with regulations that are ambiguous, and they're subjective. And when you get into ambiguous and subjective regulations or standards to try to meet, on my side of the desk, it looks like a great proposal. And the other side of the table, they're saying, well, you don't meet this and this and this.
What type of wood are you using to clad the house?
Well, and
What?
sometimes that ambiguity makes it difficult for both parties, because the people that are submitting the proposal are looking at it from one perspective, and the people that are reviewing the proposal, they don't see it that way. So I agree with what you started off this meeting. I think if the ordinance can be fine-tuned so that it removes some of that ambiguity, that'll go a long ways to helping the whole review process on both sides.
Right.
Because then when people want to nominate a tree for the heritage tree, they'll have a little bit better criteria to determine if it even meets the standard.
We have a question in that area. If a citizen does want to make an application, what kind of access to information or technical support can they reasonably expect from city staff?
Minimal.
None? Or?
Minimal.
Very little.
Very little.
No, that is.
We're not arborists. We don't have that expertise in the city that we just go out. Really, this was intended to be taking an interest in a tree, doing necessary research and turning it in.
Yeah.
It wasn't to turn it into us and have us process and research and put together.
Yeah, I mean, I can reasonably expect, based on some, history, that at some point you're going to get an application to preserve an oak tree, and when you go and look at it, it's an elm, because they don't know the difference. but, it's, oh well, it says oak everywhere, but, there's only one tree in that location, and it's an elm, and you get the thing with firs and pines. I can't tell them apart. So those are the sort of things that will probably come up, and, okay, you misidentified it, so does that reject the application, or do you amend the application because,
I'm not so worried about the single tree. The single tree is manageable.
Yeah.
It's these larger ones
Yeah.
that are just
Yeah.
minimal information relative to the size of the request.
What I'm hearing you say that you're going to spend public funds on the processing of this application. And is the city commission prepared to support this process if indeed public funds, maybe a rash of applications come in, and you get up a safe $100,000 of evaluation by an arborist or this or that? Is the city commission prepared to deal with that budgetary factor? And I don't hear you saying they are.
I don't have a specific line item for it. It makes
Well,
it very
and I would
difficult.
suggest that what we've got to do is find out if the commission is indeed willing to support that situation if it should develop. Because you're talking about a significant expenditure here.
Well,
Well,
that's,
again, it's an unfunded mandate.
It is. It truly
That,
is.
on the one hand, we've got an ordinance, but there's no mechanism to either enforce it or to even process the application.
And I'm a little disappointed, like the last one we're dealing with now is really an argument between two neighbors of which we're getting drawn
Yeah.
into through the Heritage Tree Program, which is never what it was intended for.
Well,
And that's what's very
Then I
frustrating.
would recommend that you go to the commission and ask the question, or at least the city manager, and ask the question, this thing is starting to get out of hand, and it could indeed be that. And that would be my recommendation, that we get some feedback, before we start making recommendations from the city manager's office. Is he prepared to do, cross-source with the commission? Or the applicant, because you're talking about some real funds here.
I'm thinking we're running kind of late. Would it make sense for the committee to come back with some specific language to discuss on what kinds of modifications could be made in the code to reduce the ambiguity and make it simpler for people to understand on both sides of the table what constitutes a heritage tree, so that it just streamlines the whole process.
Yeah, I think it's something that would certainly fit in your work plan. And you guys already started thinking and working about
Yeah.
that after we've got a couple of these under our belt.
Yeah.
I think the timing, fortunately, it's not in the land use section, so it is a little bit easier to change. I don't have to go through all the massive public notice as it refers to Chapter 17.
Maybe we could get back together in a couple months and revisit your recommended language.
Yeah.
One question I would have is, how does PrAC fit into this? In other words, we don't act independently or anything, so, we're kind of in...
Is the tree going to work?
Pardon
And
me?
that's why it did go to water, because it was in water board. Scott did present it to PrAC.
The city
commission
hasn't decided on this.
Yeah, we're going to take this, we're going to take water board and public works facility to them in a work session in July, just to talk about all these same issues.
and maybe you
But how
should-
does PrAC play into it?
In terms of definitions and so forth, and, just...
Yeah, do they have a different definition of grove than what you're working with?
Well,
You know?
they can only go on city regulations.
Well, I'm just saying, that's the sort of
I
what
think
if.
it's something where once we started crafting language, we would probably have Scott run it by them and see if they had questions or if they were okay with it. Really, I guess, once again, I don't think anybody envisioned whole parks being numb, so we really didn't have a whole lot of interaction with them. They seemed fine with it, yeah. But, we're going to have to think about that a little bit. We would definitely coordinate with them. I don't know if we need to all get together and meet. We could probably do it independently on separate tracks.
One thing I think would be really helpful, having just had a flat tire over at Lawn State Park, is it seems as long as there's not the right adequate access, I guess, to technical resources or stuff going on. It gets down to kind of like budgets and resources and things. And what the new fiscal year starts July 1st. Maybe within this next following fiscal year is trying to explore what kind of resources the city needs, or what kind of process could we have input to the city to get them to consider. Because otherwise we're just going to go with a flat tire because we don't have, the technical staff or access to resources or whatever, but maybe explore some way to have the resources we need access to so we get the questions answered, so we're not constantly.
And that's where I'd be more comfortable, is having the resources so that when we do go leverage volunteer hours, we can do something meaningful with it. There's been so many times where we've gotten information and we just don't have the staff availability to process it correctly and implement anything.
So you get
So I mean, if it's more of a well thought out plan of, okay, here's our first step, here's what we can accomplish, and here's what we need in terms of resource, 20,000 or 15, whatever it is, and then we start there. I think that's how we start. That's how I envision building this, the tree program in the city and the education that needs to go along with that, and Arbor Day, and Tree City USA designation. I mean, we are moving in a very good direction with what we have available to us to do. And so I think that's exactly
But we
what
could
we do.
use it this following fiscal year.
6 months. We have 6 months.
Well, it's 6 months, but maybe get some feedback, from whoever, the decision makers, policy makers, and what information would they need from us in order to justify, budget allocations to support that kind of staffing.
And I guess I say 6 months because we really
Sure.
start our budgeting process right around the end of January.
Okay, sure, I understand.
So then we can get it in the queue to get it adopted by July 1.
Well, maybe initially you look at a part-time position that would actually function partially as a technical person, but also as a volunteer coordinator for some of these things we've talked about.
And I guess, I hate being the budget money guy. I think David Frazier did come and speak a little bit about the resources and priorities. He has a priority of hires as well. Adding staff is very, very difficult right now.
Yep.
It is extremely difficult.
What some jurisdictions actually do, though, in the sense of having a shared volunteer coordinator, if you had somebody who would be working part of it, maybe point FTE 3 or whatever, or crime prevention or whatever, so they're about the police department and maybe doing community development, 0.5. I'm just saying there's a way to share certain positions between departments where maybe different folks are kicking in to give fractional assistance that might make it more tenable than just, trying to put the monkey on one department's back.
I understand. I just don't just assume we're going to go with a plan and it's only a part-time FTE.
Because it's
Our-
part-time FTE taken away from something they're supposed to be doing already.
I mean, I really do. I appreciate where you're trying to look for alternatives. I know I've had my boss has come to here are our priorities right now. Here's what the commission's priorities are, and like you said, though, we need to start that discussion
Maybe we
of
need
what
to
is the
educate-
real priority for the city on this issue.
Basically, what you're saying is adding staff at this time is just not realistic, even if it's just a fractional
I
FTE.
mean, we're not adding staff.
And that's, that's the reality, that goes hand in hand with all these things we're talking about is, we talked about that whole survey of the neighborhood, that was brought up last meeting. And, you could have a list that goes as long as your arm of things that would be great to have done, but you can't do them all. That's just the reality.
It's the hard choices of prioritization. They're all good ideas. I mean, they really are. It's really difficult.
But I do think if your committee could come back in a couple months or whenever that would work out with some recommended language that would help tighten up the language and reduce some of that ambiguity, that would help a lot in future situations where you either eliminate the word grove and come up with another definition that was easier to define, or just zero in on that single tree that's a historic tree.
And I guess the only thing I'd throw in there is that we have to remember who is doing this. And then the general public usually. And unless we really are going to raise that threshold to where, how much information do we need to make a decision? And how much onus are we going to put back on the person who's submitting.
Yeah,
And
because ultimately it's going to cost him some dollars too.
it potentially could be, yeah.
But when somebody comes in with an application, don't you point to the criteria?
Yeah, but I don't have a,
Address those?
yeah, and
I mean,
this
that's
goes,
the level of information needed.
right, well, and it's a lot easier to do in the land use world, because I have Oregon revised statute, I have city code. You know, I'd almost want to add a line
You've
that
got
says.
25 years of precedent. They've
Well,
got 25 days.
Or we add something in this section that says, if you do not address these, the community development director will not process this application. You know, because then I can point to that, because otherwise they're going, well, look, it's a beautiful tree. Here's the picture of it. Look how big it is. It's 37 inches. You only want it to be
So, yeah,
34.
you need
Go with it.
Not the community development director will not, but is not authorized.
That's what, yeah, so if I have that,
That language.
You need
know,
some language to put some teeth into the review process.
But then when you can stagger checklist.
Require written responses
So
to the
somebody can
criteria.
understand.
I guess what I'm trying to think is you have kind of experience knowledge gap between maybe where some of the citizens are, trying to participate in the process and the information expectations that the city has, and some kind of one-page cheat sheet, guideline, bullet point kind of thing. Have you thought about this? Just almost kind of a decision thing that help them produce a better quality document. The time invested in doing that could save hours, days, weeks of staff or committee time, trying to figure out what the heck did they mean by that. Whereas if you ask them to define things better, think some things through, it could save us all a lot of time and work.
You know,
and I guess going back to the water board part, I mean, they weren't going to do a survey. They were not going to do an inventory of the trees. So then what do I do with that? Do I sit there and go, I'm not going to process this. I don't care. And they're going, well, we want to take it up. The neighborhood association has voted to turn this in, and you're not going to run it. I mean, that's how it went. So I didn't have anything where I could I could sit there and have said, okay, we're not going to do this. And it would have gone straight to city commission anyway. So I figured I might as well run it.
Yeah, why not let it go like that?
I mean, and point out, and
Which is
have this
kind of
conversation.
Your staff report is there,
Yeah, but human nature dictates that let's kill the messenger. I've been there too many times.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to, at least I'm trying to protect him against being put in that position. And the language of that intent or whatever it is, the application format, let's quit beating up on the process and the staff, and because the public is somewhat naive when it comes to making these applications. We'll get it before the commission, and they're going to get on our side no matter what. No information. We'll just ask them. You see, and so the devil's in the details in that regard, and that's why I'm being somewhat skeptical in that.
The city commission will want to be making decisions about every single potential heritage tree in the city.
Well, that's the way it's written.
That's the way it's written.
No, but I mean, that doesn't seem like the best use of their time.
Well, once again, though, we thought that this would be something you'd want to showcase.
Yeah.
We took those two up there, and it was a great. We were able to talk about. We were talking about the heritage homes and the homestead, and hey, look, we're going to do this plaque, and we're going to put it on our GIS system. This is something good. It took 5 minutes for each of them, and it was a simple vote. Waterboard Park and Public Works is probably going to be a little bit more time than that.
Probably.
There's another issue there in that Waterboard Park than other than the trees, isn't there?
There's geological hazards.
Denise?
So let me ask a question so we've already run around that question about 3 times. So let me ask you a question. So how many members are on the Natural Resource Committee, and is it fully appointed? Because I only see 3 people here tonight. Maybe the other people couldn't come, but
7.
There's
7.
There's 7. There was one member, I don't know what his status is now, that hadn't attended sufficiently. Missed
Okay, so
several
we got
meetings.
7 members, and I know I
6 are
remember
active.
talking about it, and there was a notice out for people who wanted to be on it, and we did that, so they're appointed, and they've had some meetings already. Okay,
Yeah.
just wanted to circle back around to the point.
And I mean, that was part of the delay on the
Yeah,
Waterboard
was
Park,
the-
was trying to get this. We knew we were about ready to have it set up and implemented, so it was like, well, the intent was to run these through the Natural Resources Committee,
Right.
so we delayed until they were up and running.
Right, okay, that's it.
As part of your languagey thing, one thing I would suggest, well, yeah, that's, you know, you might want to suggest that they implement language in there that says, you know, trees within the boundaries of a charter park are presumed to have heritage status or something like that. Just so that at least, you know, half a dozen parks are just, you know, they're a charter park. They're clearly a standard above and beyond, you know, Wesley Lynn, you know, where, you know, and at least,
Well,
you know, that gets some of this
I
issue.
haven't thought in that direction, but in a sense, the fact that it is a charter park would support a heritage nomination because it's historically it's significant.
But it
as a
doesn't
charter
need
park.
it because it's a heritage,
Right,
it's already a heritage
protected, so
site,
in practice,
charter park.
Yeah, in practice, it will make very little difference.
Yeah.
Well, we've got the McLaughlin Promenade, which is a charter.
Yeah.
We've got Library Park, which is a charter.
Atkinson. Yeah.
Atkinson and the park that I don't know if the McLaughlin House area has an official name, but it was platted and chartered by.
Except that that's federal property now.
No, it's only leased.
Oh,
We
okay.
still own the land.
Okay.
It's still a city park that the feds have jurisdiction over for $1 a year, but it is a city park.
Well, can I suggest?
So we watched the video, and
we
I'm ready to go home.
conclude by giving these guys the assignment to come back to us with
Sure.
I would agree to
some
that.
specific language.
Yeah, get some
And-
Or some
stuff
suggested
together.
language.
Yeah, you know,
And then I would, you know, I don't know if I'm empowering you, but I'd say, as being on several committees where I have power, if you don't understand what's going on with the applications, tell the applicant you need more information. Please come back with more.
Too late
So-
out there, we voted.
Well, I understand, but I mean, there's, you know, we got the future in front of us.
Hindsight is
You're
20/20.
setting, you are setting the precedent. You're determining where the bar is. You know, I'd say as long as it's not a monetary thing, set the bar, you know, where you're comfortable at. And, you know, if that means that the applicant needs to spend an extra, you know, day to write it up and, you know, or print it so that it's legible, you know, all the, you know, whatever that may be, you know, do that because believe me, from sitting on the city commission, as soon as you vary from where that bar is, that's the new bar. And even if you say this is an exception, oh no, the next one is last time you, and there's 7 pages saying this is no. So you take the time, you know, upset people if you need to set the bar where, you know, it's defensible and clear, and, you know, clear and objective is the simplest standard you can get to. And there's 4 things. Excuse me, applicant, which one of these 4 are you applying under? I can't see it in your application.
We've already.
I know.
We've said that like 5 times now, so can I click the thing so we can see this?
sure.
Good advice.
Let's go.
So this is part of, to get our nomination for our Tree City USA. So we held an Arbor Day celebration out at
Jacobs
Jacobs Park. With
There's
this.
Tony.
So Mount Pleasant Elementary School.
The last class.
I'd like to introduce to you the mayor of Lincoln City. Third graders were setting community, and we've talked about the mayor, right? And second graders are going to learn all about community next year. Anyway, this is our mayor, Doug Kelly.
Why are you here?
The boy was trying to kick the dirt.
We didn't have a shovel.
Very good.
So we had a goal of no rain and no flying. We accomplished both.
Good old Oregon City clay.
What are you doing about this?
some big 7th and 8th graders there.
No, it's just good old drop of the hill clay, yeah.
They are the reason plants and trees are the reasons that we have oxygen. Without them, we wouldn't. But that's where the oxygen goes. What other reasons are there? Yes. Well, in many areas they prevent erosion when they're planted. What's erosion? Does anybody know? It's where the soil is.
I'm only a second
The soil can move and the soil can be destroyed, but the trees protect the soil. Any other reason?
Trees are really important for animals. Oh, and how so? Because they live in them, millions of animals do. And if you cut down the trees, then they will have a home. That's true. But why would we cut down trees? Because they break down animals' homes, and if you break down a tree, and you want all those animals, well, like, where would they have to go? They'll probably die. Yeah, they could die. Trees? Yes.
Yeah, the basic shit.
Plant or art link where they come popping out.
Trees. And if you cut down a tree, and more oxygen will go away. Because the trees have.
She looks so distressed.
Trees make paper too.
That's right, without them we couldn't go to the bathroom.
Is there anything else that you benefit indirectly? Does anybody write up paper? What is the paper done for? Are any of the houses or apartments that you live in built of wood? Where does the wood come from? Trees, without trees, I don't know we'd even be here. Okay, they're very important to us. Now, I'll tell you what, we're not going to cut down the trees and make lumber out of them. These are trees that are going to the parks here. But these trees are all indigenous trees. Indigenous means there are trees that were originally here.
SB turned around.
These are not trees that come from other places. These are trees that are here. And it's probably the best.
Right now we're going, how on earth are we going to manage all these kids?
Like 150 kids. Without maples, but that's not the tree you're planting. But yes, we do have maples here. Oak trees, that's true, we have them here, but it's not the kind of tree. Let me give you a hint. Does anybody remember my name?
No.
Mayor.
You're the mayor. You're the mayor.
Give me the last name of the tree. Douglas firs. We have Douglas firs, they're indigenous trees, and you're going to be
Mayor
planting.
fir.
But they weren't named after the mayor.
What's his name? Mayor
For
Fur.
us to plant, they didn't charge us any money. There are two nurseries. Both of these nurseries are in Canby. You gotta wait your turn now. But these are in Canby, and RFA Nurseries and Willamette Seedling Nurseries in Canby gave us these trees to plant. Now, I don't think anybody from the nurseries are here, but I think we ought to applaud anyway. So let's give them a hand.
So,
Your next
It was
video,
fun.
you might look at a little bit better sound quality.
Well, we don't know who was filming it.
Is this on the website?
Yeah, it's under the community video section.
I'll try it.
There you go, Tony. There you go.
Good job. Good job, guys.
Yeah, if we do more events like that, it'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But, yeah, this is one of the prerequisites for applying for Arbor Day, Tree City USA. So at the end of the year, we'll be turning in that application because December 15th is the day.
Cool. Okay.
All right.
Very good.
Thank you, guys.
Good night. Thank you.
We're sharing that down the